Hi everyone. I'm Aaron and I work for the Birmingham Backcountry Wildlife Trust. I've been studying solitary bees for a couple of years now. I first got into them when I was a volunteer at the RSPB, and I knew really nothing about them. I didn't know the difference between bumblebees and honeybees. I didn't even know that solitary bees existed. And I just became really fascinated by them because I was helped out by a volunteer there who knew a little bit about them. And I just found them endlessly fascinating. And now I work for a couple of organisations like the People's Trust for Endangered Species and the British Entomological Society to conduct research on pollinators. And so I thought I would do a little presentation today about how you guys at home can get involved in identifying and recording solitary bees, and really put yourself on the pathway to sort of becoming a bit more specialised in this area. So these are the topics that we'll be looking at today, not necessarily in this order, but I'm going to assume that nobody knows anything about bees and go from the very, very beginning and teach you all the sort of basics to get you involved. There are lots and lots of bee species in the UK, 270 of them, and because of that, it's quite complicated and it can get quite convoluted talking about them, and it can often put people off actually learning about them because there's so many and it's perceived that they're a very, very difficult group. But today I want to just sort of briefly introduce a number of those species to you and talk a little bit about their ecology and the different genre that you get in the United Kingdom. And more than anything, just to inspire people to want to learn more about them and get you on that road. So we'll be covering everything from the basics of entomology, the evolution of bees, what actually is a solitary bee, and how do solitary bees differ from social bees, how you differentiate a bee from a fly and a wasp and a sawfly and all the other hundreds of insects that there are out there, how to identify the sex of a bee, and then the end of the presentation we will look a little bit at common species that you get in your garden and little tips and tricks for how you can actually go about identifying those. And if you have any questions, then you can feel free to ask me these at the end of the presentation. Entomology is it's a difficult science, and it's actually a branch of zoology. And zoology is a biological science in itself, and entomology is associated with the study of insects. It used to be associated with the study of all invertebrates, but now it mainly focuses on insects. And an insect is any organism or any arthropod that has 6 legs. And there's a lot of species out there. They're incredibly abundant and very ubiquitous. There's 1.3 million of them described species in the world, but there's many, many millions more that we haven't described yet and haven't actually found. And they account for 2/3 of all life on this planet. These species or groups are really important to the health of an ecosystem. And you might have heard this quite frequently in the news or reading articles, that insects are really important for all life on Earth, but you may not know exactly why. One of the reasons is because of how old they are. They were some of the first organisms to actually colonize land from the sea, and some of the first animals to be able to colonize the air as well. And because of this, their ancient sort of lineage, it makes them the cornerstone of the ecosystem. Lots of other animals evolved around them, adapted their lifestyle and their ecology to these organisms. And because of that, they're incredibly dependent on the ecological roles that these organisms play in order to survive. And the abundance of them is quite staggering, and the diversity. So if you're just looking at, there's a fact that 1 in every 5 animals on planet Earth is actually a beetle. And some people say it's 1 in every 3. And you don't have to go far to find insects. You don't have to go far to find beetles and other flies and things like that. You can find them in your garden, and quite interesting species too. But the main groups that people associate with insects are the Coleoptera, which are the beetles, the Lepidoptera, which are things like butterflies and moths, the Diptera, or the true flies, that's like your common housefly, and then the group that we're going to be looking at today, the complicated sounding word, the Hymenoptera. And that includes all bees, wasps, ants, sawflies, parasitic wasps, and anything that is of that sort of physiological look. In the UK, we might be a fairly small island, but we're quite blessed in the fact that we have a lovely proportion of the entire fauna, invertebrate fauna, that's in Europe. And because of that, because we have a small proportion of it, it means that we have studied it incredibly well, arguably better than any other country in the world. And that's particularly the case for bees. So we know more about our bees in the United Kingdom than any other country knows about their bees in the whole world, and that is debatable. But we have a lot of other species in the UK, and what's interesting is to note is that invertebrates often don't get the attention that they really deserve and need. We have 100 species, 107 species of mammal in the United Kingdom, 7 species of amphibian, quite a few different species of bird, and a few reptiles. But when it comes to invertebrates, and particularly insects, they far outnumber and far outweigh, both in abundance and diversity, the number of birds, mammals, amphibians, and reptiles combined. An example of that is we've got 4,000 species of beetle, 2,000 species of bug, and a bug isn't just a collective term for insect. Bug is a grouping within the insects, like aphids, for example. We have 7,000 species of fly, and it's estimated that we have around 9,000 species of wasp. Many of these are parasitic wasps, not the yellow jacket that you see on the picture there. And it's actually true that we have more species of fly just in the United Kingdom than there are species of mammal in the whole world. And when you really consider that and let that sink in, and you understand how many more people actually study mammals and study birds than study insects, you can see where the problem really lies. So I always urge and encourage people that have even a slight interest in insects to build on their knowledge and become part of a network of people that end up recording and learning about these species and the value they have to us as a society. The Hymenoptera, as I said, it's an order, a super order of insects, and it contains all bees, wasps, ants, sawflies, parasitic wasps, and these other insects called horntails. There are over 150,000 known species, and there's many thousands of species that we know that have gone extinct. But what's interesting about this group is that they are quite fascinating because of their social behaviour and their evolution, but they're also quite fascinating because of this group called the Aculeates. And I'll be referring to the Aculeates throughout this presentation, and you'll probably read it in books and things if you're starting to learn about bees. The Aculeates are a grouping within the Hymenoptera. They're a small group of species that got rid of their ovipositor, which is an egg-laying device. It's like a small needle that comes out of the abdomen, and they replaced it with a stinger. So any insect that has 4 wings and a stinger is an Aculeate. And all social and solitary bees and wasps are part of that grouping, and as are ants as well. So this is just a bit about the evolution of bees. The Hymenoptera, this superorder, is made up of many, many different layers and many different groups. People often ask me, what's the point in wasps? Like, why do we have wasps? And it really, the point of wasps is huge. Not only do they have an ecological role where they clear up the ecosystem and they're great apex predators and they hunt and they keep the ecosystem in balance, but they're also responsible for the evolution of bees and for ants and for parasitic wasps and for sawflies. So what happened was, a few 100 million years ago, the first sort of primordial insect, the common ancestor of all of these organisms, was a primordial wasp. And this insect divergently evolved 3 or 4 times during its evolution. And when that happens, you have a population that gets split into two populations, and then that one of those populations has to adapt to a different set of environmental factors to the other population. And because of that, they adapt differently, they have different physiological features, and in time they become a completely different species or group altogether. And that's what happened with this primordial wasp. A few 100 million years ago, this wasp diverged and became the symphyter, which is the sawflies. And you probably may have never seen a sawfly, but I'll come on to them a little bit later. These are fat-bodied wasp-like insects, and they eat pollen, but they don't pollinate plants. And then a few million years later, this primordial wasp evolved again, and it became the parasitica. And a parasitica is a massive group. It could be the most abundant and diverse group of organisms on Earth. And you have insects like ichneumons and calcid wasps, which have these ovipositors. It's pretty gruesome. They poke their ovipositor into an organism like a caterpillar, and they lay an egg, and then it hatches and bursts out. And along this evolutionary line, a little bit later, you have the development of the Aculeates, or the Aculeata. And these are the stingers. These are the insects that lost their ovipositor and replaced it with a stinger. And you have the bees, wasps, and ants in this group. And what's interesting about the Aculeates, more than anything else, is the fact that they evolved sociality, which is something that's really interesting to scientists, trying to understand how these very, very complex societies evolved in insects. So when I refer to the Aculeates, you know I'm talking about bees, wasps, and ants. So what is a bee? It's actually a difficult question to answer. Some people can recognize a bee on sight. Other people struggle because there's a lot of insects that look very similar. But essentially it's an insect with two pairs of wings. So it has four wings. It has the forewings, which are quite large, and then it has these miniature sort of hind wings. But it also has a stinger, and it tends to be really fluffy. A bee is a pollen collecting machine. Its entire role in life is to collect as much pollen as it possibly can. It is designed to do that, to collect as much pollen as possible. And unlike their ancestors, the wasps, they don't hunt for prey. They're not carnivores. And so they tend to be much thicker coated in hair than wasps are. And you get different types of bees. You get two broad categories. You get social bees, like bumblebees and honeybees, which represent just 1% of all the 20,000 species of bee in the world. And then you get the solitary bees, which are far less known, but arguably far more important. And these involve things like mining bees, masonry bees, furrows, carpenters, resin bees, leaf cutters, blood bees. There's quite a few, and it does go on. But there's a really amazing diversity of these species in the United Kingdom, and they all occupy a different ecological niche, and they all have a succession, just like flowers have a succession. That's because they emerge at different times of year to exploit different flowers at different times of year. When you get started identifying bees, it's always important to know a little bit about their anatomy, and this goes for any insect or any animal in general. And really, an insect, it's easy with bees because they're a good prototype for how all insects should be thought of. An insect is essentially an animal that has three segmented parts. It has a head, it has a midrib, which we call a thorax, and it has an abdomen or an abdominal segment, which in bees we call tergites. And all these three bits together, they make the bee in general. But what makes a bee even more special is that it has this other feature, which we call a corbicula or a pollen basket, or pollen collecting hairs. And these are always on the hind legs, the hind tibia. And you can often see bees actually coating pollen onto this part of their body. And that's how you really know you've got a bee. If it's collecting pollen, it's sticking it on its tibia. And it often looks a little bit like this. But there's a lot of insects, as I've said earlier, that actually mimic bees. And the reason they do that, it's called Bayesian mimicry. And the reason they do it is it's an evolutionary defense mechanism for a lot of insects that don't have the weaponry that bees have to protect themselves from other predators. The main culprits for this are flies, and flies are fantastic for this because they go to quite extreme lengths to pretend that they are a bee, but they are actually a fly. So flies like Volucella bombilans, which is a hoverfly and a bumblebee mimic. And I mean, even to some ecologists, it's very difficult to distinguish when you first see it, whether it's a bee or a fly. So if you imagine that you're an insect or you're a predator and you see something that looks like a bee, you probably leave it alone. But there's many different other organisms that do this as well. So wasps look superficially resemble bees, and sawflies too. So I thought I'd go a little bit over other groups so that you know when you are looking at a bee that it's definitely a bee and it's not a fly and it's not a sawfly. So true flies are a fantastic group. They are the Diptera in Latin, and Diptera just means two-winged. Di means two, terra means wing. And these insects only ever have one pair of wings. They'll never have two like bees, wasps, and sawflies. So that's the big key thing. If you're looking at an insect and it's got two wings and they're quite nicely fanned out, then you're looking at a fly. But the other things that can help are the eyes. I always find that fly eyes are massive, and they basically make up about 90% of their head. There's not really much space for a forehead in between. They're really bulbous, and they're just massive eyes. They also have a physiological feature called a haltere. And a haltere is basically like a rudder, and it steadies the insect as it flies, and it allows the insect to move its head whilst keeping its body in one position. And that's how flies can fly so incredibly well. And you can see it's just underneath the thorax, underneath the wing, and it kind of looks like a small spoon that's coming out the side of them. And if you see a haltere on an insect, you're definitely looking at a fly, and it could be nothing else. Wasps are, as they're related to bees, they make things a little bit more complicated and a bit more difficult. So the social wasp, Vespula vulgaris, is one that I doubt many people would ever think is a bee. It's quite large and most people hate it, and so it's quite well known as being a wasp. But solitary wasps also exist, and they can cause some confusion. But wasps are different to bees in the fact that they don't collect pollen. They sometimes eat pollen, but they don't collect it. And because they don't collect it, it means that they haven't evolved the physiological features that will allow them to collect it. This basically means that they're just not hairy. They don't have pollen baskets. They don't have a really hairy abdomen. They don't have hair on the underside of their abdomen either. They tend to be very hairless, very sleek. Some species have a stalk in between their abdomen and their thorax, often called a petiole, and that almost immediately identifies it as a wasp. It could be nothing else because only wasps have that. Personally, I think wasps actually have meaner looking faces as well. If you get close enough to see one, that is. They tend to have quite large jaws, and that's because they're hunters and they go around biting the legs off spiders and all sorts of things. But yeah, they're quite small, they're quite sleek, and they also have quite large eyes as well. But they just have a sort of meaner look to them than bees do. But often, a lot of the time, male solitary bees can get confused with wasps because there's a lot of crossover. They look quite similar. But the key thing is the fact that they lack hair, they don't have pollen brushes on them, and they have meaner looking faces. There's 250 Aculeate wasps in the UK, so there's 250 wasps with stingers, and about 9,000 parasitic wasps, which you don't need to worry about them at all. The other and final group that people most often confuse with bees are the sawflies. And a sawfly is not a fly, as its name might suggest. They do that just to trick you. Sawflies are a part of the Hymenoptera. They have 4 wings, just like bees and wasps do. But the key thing that a sawfly has that a wasp or a bee doesn't have is a fat-bodied waist. It doesn't have the wasp waist, as seen in this picture here. It's a fat-bodied insect. It has 4 wings. The wings are massive. The wings are usually much bigger than the wings of a bee. And the wing venation, so the veins that go through the wings, tend to be far more complicated than those of bees and wasps. They lack pollen baskets because these guys don't eat pollen. Well, no, these guys don't collect pollen. They just gorge on pollen. You'll often find them on the top of flowers just eating themselves silly, eating the pollen silly. And they tend to be quite brightly coloured as well. So you get some Tethendro species which are bright green on their abdomen. They're quite sleek, but you'll always notice a sawfly because it doesn't have the wasp waist. It's just a fat-bodied insect. And these guys can be found in grasslands all over the country. They're really awesome, and they have quite an amazing relationship with plants. They can put galls on plants and manipulate the chemistry of a plant in order to make habitats for themselves. They're quite fascinating. There's differences between solitary and social bees, and once you know you have a bee, finding out that difference is the key step next in identifying it to species level. So what kind of bee might it be? There are around 270 species of bee in the UK, and as I said before, some of them are solitary and some of them are social. But there are key physical features that differentiate between the two. So of the social bees, there's only 24 species of bumblebee in the UK, and I can imagine most people can confidently identify a bumblebee when they see one. They're quite large, quite fluffy, and they're very, very common in people's gardens. And there's only one species of honeybee in the UK. That's the only other social species. A very, very famous, very incredible species, but it's actually the most studied animal on Earth. And these types of bees, they live socially. They live in hives, they live in colonies. They have to mass provision lots of young, but they make up a tiny, tiny fraction of all the species that there are out there. The other group are the solitary bees, and that's what we'll be focusing on today. These don't live in hives, they don't live in colonies. They do collect pollen, but they only collect enough pollen to feed a few offspring. And a mother bee will rear all her offspring on her own. They nest in similar areas, but they never nest really together in the same way that a fully social bumblebee or a fully social honeybee would. So one of the key features to look for in order to differentiate between a solitary or social bee is the pollen basket. Now, social bees must collect pollen for a massive number of larvae. In some bumblebee nests, there can be hundreds and hundreds of bees. In some honeybee nests, there can be up to 1,000 workers. And so that means there's a lot of mouths to feed, a lot of baby bees that need pollen and nectar. So that means that for a bumblebee or a honeybee, when they collect pollen, they need to collect as much pollen as they possibly can. And they need to make sure that pollen does not fall off them when they're flying, when they're bumbling between flower heads. The way they do that is they actually lick the pollen, or they add saliva and nectar to it, and they make it wet, and then they manipulate it onto their leg in a weird ball. And so social bees, they have something called a corbicula. It's a pollen basket. And it's important to note that whenever a bee collects pollen, it will only ever do this on its back legs or on its abdomen. Some of them actually dive bomb into the front of the pollen. But a social bee collects this pollen on its back leg in its pollen basket. And bumblebees and honeybees do this, and you can often actually see them flying around with these little balls, bright balls of pollen on their legs. So if you see a bee doing that, then you know it's a social bee, because a solitary bee will never carry pollen in that same way. It will never have a big, sticky, wet ball of pollen on its leg. And so a social bee carrying one looks a little bit like this. So this is a honeybee. Honeybees are quite interesting because they have hairy eyes as well, and they have kind of red, sort of reddish tinge to their abdomen. And as you can see, it's collecting pollen on its hind pollen basket, and it's wetting the pollen so it can more easily fly between flowers. And it actually means that it doesn't drop a lot of the pollen when it flies, so it's quite efficient at taking pollen back to its nest. Solitary bees don't do this, and they collect pollen in two different other ways, which, if you can understand, can help you actually get your identification down to genus level quite quickly. So some solitary bees carry pollen on their tibial hairs, so the hind leg. They've got like not a pollen basket, but they've got like hairs that stick out that collect the pollen. And then another group, the masonry bees and the leafcutter bees, they don't have tibial hairs, they have a scopal hair. So this is your osmias and your leafcutters. They collect pollen on sort of brushes underneath their abdomen, and they're really, really messy pollinators. They'll just rub their abdomen in the pollen, and then they'll fly off and they'll scatter it everywhere. It's also important to note that in solitary bees, they tend not to wet their pollen. They collect dry pollen, and that's why you can usually see it on their legs. It looks kind of like they've got really swollen thighs, but that's just the pollen building up and making it look like they've got really big thighs. So, tibial hairs. Looks like that on the hind leg. It's a pollen brush loaded with dry grains of pollen. And mainly mining bees and furrow bees carry the pollen in dry powder form on their legs like this. And if you don't know what they are, I'll come on to them later, so don't worry. But it can also look like streaks of yellow on their leg or streaks of white on their actual leg when they're flying. So it does look quite different to how a sticky ball of pollen looks on a bumblebee or a honeybee. And the red mason bee, as you can see here, or other osmias, they collect pollen on their scopa, which are like hairs on the underside of their abdomen. And the main culprits for this are the leafcutters and the osmias. And sometimes they look like the underbody of the bee is a bright orange or yellow, and you don't want to get tricked by that. That's just the colour of the pollen coming off on the leg, on the pollen brush of the bee, and it can be quite confusing with identification sometimes. So just to summarise, these are the different ways that bees actually collect the pollen. You have the pollen basket in the honeybee or bumblebee. You have the tibial pollen brush in the mining bees and the furrow bees. And then you have the abdominal pollen brush, the scopa, in the mason bees and leafcutter bees. So it's an important thing to look out for, and it can really help you with identification. Once you know that you've got a social bee or a solitary bee, you can then distinguish whether it's a male or a female. And this can be a little bit more complicated than it might first seem. Males, their role in the whole process of bee life is to mate and reproduce and just die. That's their whole sort of role in it. Females do all the nest building, all the pollination, pretty much all the hard work. And so that means that females tend to be a bit larger than males. They also tend to be a lot hairier, a lot prettier. And males tend to be a bit wimpy looking, to be honest. They're a bit more wasp looking because they're hairless. Males have 13 segments to their antennae, females have 12. It's often that males also have little bits of white patches of hair on the front of their face, which can be quite a distinguishing factor. Sometimes the sexual dimorphism between males and females can be quite strong. So that means that the differences between males and females of the same species can be really strong, or it could be really weak. And we'll come on to some examples of that shortly. So once you've got it down to, you know it's a bee, you know it's not a fly, you know it's a solitary bee and not a social bee, you know it's a male or a female. Now getting it down to species, it can be a really, really tricky part of the whole process. And I have to be honest, most solitary bees can't be accurately identified without taking a specimen. And it requires a lot of training in order to do that. But there are a number of species that visit gardens which people can identify through photographs, through observations, as long as you know a little bit about them and about their ecology. And I would really suggest that people go out there and start looking for bees, because they're in need of citizen scientists like yourself to actually help us understand what they're doing, what's happening to their population. In the UK, we have 6 species of bee, 6 families of bee, and they can be sort of superficially broken into long-tongued bees and short-tongued bees. The Melitidae are a small group of about, I think, 4 species, sorry, and they include blunt thorn bees, which have like blunt antennae. The Apidae are a really large group. They contain all the bumblebees and the honeybee. The Megacholidae contain the Osmia and the megachiles, which are the leafcutters and the masonry bees. The Andronidae is the largest group of bees that we have in the United Kingdom, and they can be a real pain because of how many there are and how similar they look. And there's 69 species of Andrena, but they are the most, quite possibly the most important bees that we have in this country, because they're such amazing ecosystem engineers. They nest underground. The Halictidae are also mining bees, and they have what we call a furrow, which I'll come on to in a little bit. And then we have the Coletidae as well. And these are plasterer bees, and these are aerial nesters, and they should actually be up there, but they coat the inside of their nest with a plaster-like substance, which hence gives them their name. So these species that I'm about to go through now, these groups, are ones that you're quite likely to find in your garden at some point or in your local park. Most of these are based on records from the West Midlands. So if you live in the West Midlands, then these are species that I definitely know live there. But most people are coming across these types of bees more and more frequently. So the first one I wanted to look at was the Hylaeus, or the yellow-faced bees. These are really cool looking animals. They're very slim black bees. They lack hairs all over their body because they don't actually collect pollen in the same way that other bees do. Instead, they eat the pollen and then they drink the nectar. They go back to their nest and then they regurgitate that onto their larvae, a little bit like a bird would. And because of this, they have very hairless bodies. But the really cool feature about these bees is that they have this yellow coloration to their face, these markings all over the face. males have a lot more yellow than females. So males, the whole face tends to be yellow. And females have like little small triangular projections which hug the eye margin of the face. There's 12 species known in the United Kingdom. And if you have a bee box, then these guys are very, very likely to visit your bee box. And they are emerging around about now, probably not today because the weather's so terrible, but over the next couple of weeks, you'll start to see more of these yellow-faced bees in your garden or in your local park if you look quite closely. One species that I think is quite fairly simple for people to identify is the common yellow-faced bee, Hylaeus communis. And what's interesting about this species is, as I said before, the male has more extensive markings than the female. And what's interesting is that the yellow markings actually hug the antennal socket of the eye. They sort of go just around the edge of the eye like that. So if you know you're looking at a bee and it's got this kind of cool looking yellow face to it, and it's very extensively yellow faced, and the yellow marking goes around the eye socket like that, you know you're looking at a male yellow faced bee, a Hylaeus communis. The female have these two tiny yellow projections which hug the inside of the eye, and they're often accompanied by the male. But they look a little bit like this. They're very small bees, a couple of half a centimetre probably. And like I said, yes, the female has yellow triangular markings. If you've got a bee box, what I used to do when I was first studying them was I'd shine a torch or just my phone light down the holes in the bee box. And sometimes you'd see a little fleck of yellow shining back at you. And that's how you know that you've got a yellow-faced bee in there. And yeah, they're really quite interesting looking creatures. The andrinas, as I've said before, are a massive group of mining bees. In fact, they are actually adding new species to this list as species migrate over from the continent, and DNA analysis shows that one species is actually being split into two species, so this group is ever changing. These bees are arguably the most important that we have in the United Kingdom. They can form very, very dense nesting aggregations, and by that I mean that individuals nest side by side next to other individuals. They prefer sandy habitats, and males always appear before females. Their flight period varies, but you can get most of these bees during springtime, and they're brilliant ecosystem engineers because what they do is they excavate soil, and in their excavation, they create habitats for other insects to live. So there's actually bees called like mini miners that will live in the holes dug by mining bees. They're quite furry species, can be quite colourful, and the key feature for knowing whether you have an andrina, they have a general gist to them, and when you get used to it, you'll start to notice this. But they have something called facial fovae, which it's a fancy way of saying they have these streaks of hair down the inner eye margin, down the inner margins of their eyes. They're a very, very difficult group to identify. However, there are a number of species that are quite common and quite identifiable because of the colours of their fur. And so I'll go through a little bit of a few of those to just get you up to date. So this one is the ashy mining bee, Andrina cineraria. Lovely, lovely bees. Some can be quite fairly large, about the size of a bumblebee actually, the females. And what you can see here is they've got quite large jaws. They're sort of smoky coloured, and they've got sort of ashy coloration. They live in very, very dense nesting aggregations, very eusocial sort of bees where they have a relationship with members of their own species. And they're quite common in and around urban areas as well. So some people often come across bee banks, which are just like habitats, sandy habitats for bees, and you can often find quite a few of these species in there. This is my favourite bee, Andrina hemorrhoa, and the reason it's my favourite bee is because when you first start out trying to identify insects, it can be really daunting because every time you do it, you get your ID wrong. This is one bee where you can always get it right by looking at one feature, and that's the orange-tailed bum. So Andrina hemorrhoa, it's a spring flying mining bee, and it's got an orange bum, and it's got a really, really thick coat of like foxy orange thorax. And if you see a bee like this and it's in spring, it's very likely that you've got Andrina hemorrhoa, the orange-tailed mining bee, and it loves spring flowering plants. Andrina scotica is the chocolate mining bee, and this is one of the hardest of the three I'm going to show you today. This species is difficult because it looks like a lot of other mining bees. There's one key feature that I find is quite helpful, and that's to do with the scopal hair on the back, on its hind leg. So it's got a chocolate coloured thorax. It's quite a robust looking bee, but the hind leg has a dark overside and a bright underside. So if you're looking at a bee and you think it's a mining bee, see if you can take a photograph just showing the scopa, the hind leg, the hairs on the hind leg, and or the thorax, or both, preferably. And that should be able to tell you what it is, and very likely to be a chocolate mining bee. These are quite common species in urban areas, and I get quite a few of these in my garden in Birmingham. But they're all, yeah, they're all over the place. And quite interestingly, there is a parasite, an internal parasite called a stylops, which is a type of fly that parasitizes these bees. And I won't go into detail about it here, but if you're interested, definitely Google it. It's quite amazing. They'll put their internal parasites inside the bee, and it can basically zombify the bee and make the bee behave in a very strange way. But yeah, really interesting species there. The next group I wanted to talk to you about are the Anthrophora, or the hairy-footed bees. These are some of the first bees to emerge in spring, and as the name suggests, they've got very hairy feet for collecting pollen. They resemble bumblebees, but they're not social, they're solitary. They have thick fur on them because they emerge in spring and it's very cold and they have to stay insulated. There's only about 5 species in the UK. They love flowers like lungwort, and comfrey and pulmonera and things like that. And they have a strong sexual dimorphism. So males and females of the same species look very different. And there's only 5 species in the UK. Males have quite bright yellow faces and females can be quite dark. And there's one species, which is the hairy-footed flower bee, which is ubiquitous pretty much all over the country. The females have a jet black, this beautiful sort of charcoal black, and they've got streaks of yellow or orange usually on their legs because they're collecting pollen. And they've got the very hairy feet. They've also got these ridiculous sized tongues, which are just insane considering the size of the insect. And what they do is they fly over the flower, they hover over it, and then they dip their tongue in. They don't tend to stop. They've got a really loud, high-pitched buzzing sound, but they're very gentle bees. I've never been stung by one, and I've handled them before. The male is a completely different animal altogether. It looks completely different. It's this orangey, blondie colour to its fur, very pale legs, and it's got this bright yellow face. A very distinguishable bee, and one that most people see in their gardens in really early spring. The next group is another group of mining bees called the Hylaeus, and these are different to andrinas because they have something called a furrow, which is like a vertical line on their back, and I'll show you it in a second. The females of these bees, only the females have this line. It's called a furrow. It looks a little bit like this here, also known as a reamer, and what it essentially means is if you see a bee and it's got a reamer or a vertical groove on its back, it's either a Hylaeus or a Lasioglossum. Now these are very difficult groups to identify to species as well, but there's one species that I think is very common and very distinguishable, and that's the orange-legged furrow bee. And you can understand why it's quite interesting to spot it. It's got these bright orange legs. It's quite a large bee, quite a good mining bee, and yeah, it's widely distributed all over the world, and you can often find it emerging in summer, sort of like early to late summertime. But if you find that you have a bee that has a furrow but doesn't look anything like that, or doesn't look anything like a Hylaeus, then you may have a Lasioglossum. And Lasioglossums are the second hardest group of bees to work out in the United Kingdom. This genus differs in that they have hair bands only at the end of their tergites. And I imagine that's quite a confusing thing for me to say, so don't worry too much about it. But Lasioglossums are really quite pretty species because you do get some really interesting colour forms. This one here is the common furrow bee, Lasioglossum calceatum, and it's got quite sort of blondish looking legs. It's got the medium furrow on the end, and it's a smaller bee than the Hylaeus. They've also got quite angulated heads as well, I find, and that can be a good feature. The male has a red abdomen and has white legs, has quite long antennae as well, so it's a bit more distinguishable. The red in the abdomen really stands out on certain flowers as well. But there's also a group within the Lasioglossum which are all metallic green. So if you see, they look incredible if you ever get a chance to see one under a microscope. They're very, very small bees, a couple of millimeters in size, and they're bright green. Another group is the Sphecodes, or the blood bees. Now, this is a very difficult group because they have, you can't actually do a lot of these to species, but being able to recognize this group can be really helpful. They're often found on flowers like umbellifers, and they have this bright red on their abdomen. And what these bees do, they're kleptoparasites, or cuckoos. They'll go into the nests of other bees, and they'll take their pollen and lay their own egg, and then that egg will hatch and predate the host bee. But being able to identify a blood bee in an area helps you understand what other mining bees you might have in that area. Melita, these are the blunt thorn bees that I was talking about earlier. They look very similar to andrinas, but they have blunt antennae, and andrinas have quite sharp antennae. This species is nationally scarce, Melita hemorrhoidalis, and I've been finding it quite a lot recently. And it's got this really orange bum, hence hemorrhoidalis. And there are only 4 species of Melita in the UK, so they're not a difficult group to get started on. But they've got these very blunt antennae, and this one species, Melita hemorrhoidalis, has this very orange bum. It's definitely one to keep your eye out for if you see it. But yeah, you want to look at the antennae, and that if you're taking photographs, identify the antennae and the pollen brush on the legs. This species is called Anthidium manicatum, and there's only one of these species in the United Kingdom, which makes things a lot very easy. Very distinguishable, has a yellow all over its abdomen. Males are larger than females. They love plants like lamb's ear. They will strip all of the hairs off the lamb's ear and they'll roll it into a nest. And if anyone's ever felt lamb's ear, it's a very strange texture, a very strange soft plant. And they're very territorial. They'll guard an entire patch of lamb's ear to themselves, and they'll fight off bumblebees because they use the patch to attract a female to mate. Very distinguishable bee. So if you see anything that looks anything like that, it can only be Anthidium manicatum, the wool carder bee. These bees, the Osmias, are probably the ones that you've seen most of lately. They're very distinctive aerial nesting bees. They have a very round abdomen, quite a cute looking bee, very sort of rounded features on the head. Osmias have either a black or orange pollen brush on the underside of their body. They don't have a pollen collecting hairs on their legs, and they plug their nests up with mud and wet soil. So this one is the red mason bee, also known as Osmia rufa or Osmia bicornis. There's a lot of changeover with names, but it's actually just the same species. So this, there's another bee that's also an Osmia that I've been seeing a lot more lately, and I thought I'd give a shout out to it in case anybody else has. And that's the blue mason bee. And these are kind of metallic black blue bees in the female. And they will also live side by side with red mason bees. They're a little bit smaller than them. But the real star of the show, I think, is the male blue mason bee, Osmia caerculescens, because it's this gorgeous sort of golden-haired insect with this fantastic green glassy eye. So it's very distinctive. And if you see anything like that, you know you've got a male a male Osmia caerculescens. The other group in the megacarls are the leafcutter bees. And these are the other group that have the pollen brush on the underside of their abdomen. These guys are also very well known to people. They collect cut segments out of leaves, they collect pollen, they put them at the end of their tubes. They frequently nest in bee hotels. They fly from May to September onwards, and they're very recognizable bees. Really interesting as well, because they cut these crescent moon shapes out of many different species of plant, and they make these like cigars for their nests. And they put the males at the front and the females at the end of the nest, because they know that the males emerge first. There's two species that are fairly identifiable, but this is a very difficult group. So the first is the megacarl willoughbyella. The male of this species has these incredibly enlarged and swollen tarsi, and they're like big paws, and it actually uses those to put over the eyes of the female when they're mating to calm her. And if you see a bee and it has that feature, it's very likely you're looking at a male willoughbyella or Willoughby's leafcutter bee. The other species is the female megacarl centuncularis, or the patchwork leafcutter. And this bee is interesting because it has a pollen brush that goes all the way around the outside of its abdomen, And if you're looking down on this insect, you're looking down on this bee, it kind of looks like the pollen brush is like a little thin halo around the abdomen. So if you can see a thin yellow pollen brush around the abdomen, it could be Megacarl centuncularis. And these are very large bees and very territorial as well. This group is the sharp-tails, and these guys predate the leafcutters. And they're called sharp-tails because they have literally sharp tails. They have unusually hairy eyes, and they are very difficult to ID without a specimen. But they fly pretty much at the same time as the leafcutters do, and you'll often see them sitting on the outside of the bee box. Here is my friend's garden, and my friend Andy was sitting there looking at a hole in his chair, in his deck chair, and he found that a leafcutter was nesting inside this hole, and a Coleoptys or a sharp-tail was going inside to predate the offspring. So it's quite incredible how they're able to find each other in the ecosystem. I think the final genus is the Nomad bees, and this is a very, very large genus of bees. They all superficially resemble wasps, but they're also kleptoparasites, and they wait around the nest entrances of mining bees, and they sneak inside to lay an egg, and the egg hatches out and kills the host bee. There are 34 species in the UK, and they're quite readily recognisable because they look like wasps, but they only emerge really in early spring. And so if you see a wasp-like creature in early spring, then it's too early for wasps. It's very likely to be a nomad bee. So this one here is Nomada gudanina, and it's quite distinctive because it has these two yellow scutellus spots. It kind of looks like a face, and it also has this quite clearly punctured abdomen. And then you have Nomada leucophthalma, which is an early mining bee, an early nomad bee, and it's quite a dark-looking nomad with a glassy red eyes. Females of these species, or females of nomads, always have red all over their mouth. It kind of looks like they're wearing lipstick. Males have lots of yellow. And nomad bees really do tell you about the presence of other bees like andrinas in an area. So being able to identify the genus can be quite helpful. And just to finish up really, recording an ID is very difficult and quite hard, but there are many places you can go where people can help you. So there's the Bees, Wasps and Ants Recording Society. I think the link to this was put in the chat. They are a fantastic resource with all loads of information about ecology. There's the Bees, Wasps and Ants Facebook group, which is fantastic as well. You can post a photograph into this group and somebody will help you identify it. And if you're not into bees and into biological recording, then get involved with your local record centre and get along to FSC courses as well to try and get your identification skills up, because citizen scientists really do help in our understanding of our aculeate fauna, and every little really does make a massive difference. There's also Stephen Falk's book, A Field Guide on Bees, and he's also got a online Flickr account which you can look at really good photographs of these species, and it can be really helpful to identify them, and that's in the chat as well. So yeah, please get involved, and thank you everyone for listening. I hope I didn't go on too long.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Aaron. No, you didn't go on too long at all. Thank you for talking to us today. We've got a couple of questions in the chat already. If anyone else has any questions, please do put those in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll start going through them now. I'll also send around those links that Aaron just mentioned to BWAS and the Stephen Falk Flickr page too in the email afterwards, so you'll all have that. Okay, Aaron, we've got our first question from, oh, there's a few coming in. Sorry, first question from Rhiannon asking, how do you recommend catching bees to have a closer look at them?
Okay, you're gonna need yourself a net. You can get some good nets from Watkins and Doncaster, and use a pot and stuff the pot with some tissue paper and gently put your hand in to collect the bee. Insects always fly towards the light, so if you hold the net at the top, the insects will go to the top and you can put your hand in to collect it. But the tissue really helps because it rubs off some of the pollen and it'll help you actually identify them a little bit better. But it is a bit of a knack that you have to get used to, as some people probably already know. Get yourself the Stephen Falk book as well. It's a really good way of getting you involved in that.
Yeah, it's definitely a bit of a knack using a pot and a net. I've tried that before. Many bees have gone away from me. Oh, sorry, bear with me. Oh, we've got a question from Ed asking, are solitary bees more effective pollinators given that they don't wet the pollen?
Brilliant question, and yes, they are. I was supposed to go over this in the presentation actually, so thanks for bringing it up. It's, yeah, because they don't wet the pollen, it's in dry form. When they fly over plants, the pollen falls more successfully on the receptive anthers of flowers, which leads to more seed set. And in fact, a red mason bee is able to pollinate as many plants as 120 honeybee workers because of the fact it's able to spread the pollen much more messily when it flies. So they are much better pollinators, definitely.
That's amazing. I didn't realise that.
That's crazy.
We've got a question. Sorry, bear with me. The chat's moving around all over the place. We've got, oh gosh. Sorry, as soon as someone sends another question, it then flies off my screen. We've got a question from Mia asking, does each nomad species parasitize individual species of mining bee, or is it just any mining bee?
They parasitize individual species of mining bee. Some species will parasitize a couple of related species, but that's why they're actually really helpful to understand, because if you find a nomad bee and it has a very particular relationship with a host bee, but you don't find that host bee, then you know it's in the area because you found the nomad. There'll only be nomads where the host bees are present. So they're quite well monitored by scientists trying to understand the fauna of an area. Definitely worth looking into nomad bees, really interesting species.
Nice. And then, well, sort of leading on from that, another one about parasite. That's, how useful are bee flies in indicating what solitary bees are around?
In my area, not particularly useful because we only get Bombilius major, the dark-edged bee fly. They do tell you where solitary bees are nesting, but they don't tell you what type of solitary bee you'll have, other than the fact it will be an andrena. But in other areas of the country, more down south, where they get more types of bee fly, it could be that they're better at identifying a particular group or particular genus of bees in that area. But yeah, it's more for knowing that you've got bees in an area rather than what species it is.
Well, thank you. We've got a question from Camilla asking, what garden plants will benefit solitary bees?
A lot. I personally like a plant called fleabane. I don't even know if it's a garden plant, but I've got it in my garden. It's a really good plant for attracting. It feeds solitary bees, bumblebees, hoverflies, and butterflies all at once. It's quite a fantastic plant. The Ugle is a really good one. The blue mason bee, which I was talking about earlier, that's a really good plant for attracting that species. And certain types of the yellow-faced bees will only feed from plants like weld and wild mignonette. So there's many different species that actually have very specific relationships with certain plants. And if you put those in your garden, you're more likely to get that species. Oxidase as well, amazing plant. It's really, really good for bees, but don't underestimate it.
Thank you. I've got a question from Mark asking, when putting up bug hotels for solitary bees, where's the best location for them to be? For example, is it better to have on building sides over trees to avoid earwigs and spiders moving in?
I did a study about this when I was doing my masters. I think the best, it always has to be south-facing and about head height. Where it actually goes in terms of whether it's on a building or on a tree, I don't think it's going to really make too much of a difference, because whatever colonizes it, and it's just how it works. I think I found any area that gets the most amount of sunlight in a day, so whether that is on a tree or whether it is on a wall or on a building, that's what you need to be thinking about. The amount of sunlight hitting the surface, because bees are thermophilic, they're able to fly by absorbing temperature of the sun. So yeah, south facing tends to be best, and wherever you get a lot of sun.
Well, thank you. A question from Claire asking, please could you advise of habitats other than gardens where you can find solitary bees?
Grasslands are really good areas. I know that's quite a broad thing to say, but wildflower meadows. Sandy areas actually tend to be the best. So places like Highgate Common in Staffordshire, they're nationally renowned for their bees and wasps because they're really, really sandy areas. Lots of any sort of habitat where it's sort of like broken roots and lots of mud, lots of sandy mud and grainy materials, and anywhere that's sun-baked as well can be quite good.
Thank you. We've got more of a general question from Catherine. She's asking about, is there any help out there getting microscopes? So I was just going to say, we published a blog on this not too long ago, Catherine, about what to look for when you're looking for a microscope. So I might drop that in the chat afterwards. I will make a link of that now and I'll send that over to you because it's got some really useful information in there. Sorry about this, there's lots of questions. It's hard to read through them all. Okay, we've got one from Thomas. How close to the bees that nomad bees parasitize need to be for nomad bees to be within that area, if that makes sense?
Kind of. So if you find a nomad bee, then you know that the host bee is in the area where you found the nomad bee, because the nomad bee lives inside the host bee's nest. They literally live together. The host bee has no idea that the egg that it's sort of looking after is a nomad, in the same way that a cuckoo doesn't know that another bird doesn't know that the cuckoo has laid its egg there. Don't know if that explains your question, but basically wherever you get a nomad bee, you get its host in the area within a mile's radius and probably less.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a question from Louise asking, do leafcutter bees specialise to cut leaves of particular plant species?
This is really controversial. I think there's a study that said there were 34 different species of plants that they will go to. But I find that it's actually in your garden or in your area, which they will focus on a particular plant and they'll all just shred that plant to death. So some people find that with rose bushes. But in the RSPB in Samuel Valley, where I did some of my research, they fed off field maple, took loads of field maple, so it differs really. Good question.
Thank you. Okay, a question from Gail. She's found Sphecodes around Aculeates hederae aggregation. Sorry, I got that wrong. Are they widely known parasites, or is it likely that there are Andrena in the same aggregation?
Very likely there are Andrena in the same aggregation. Saying that though, that we're finding out new things all the time, and it could be that there's something else going on there. So that's why it's really important to document these sort of stuff and let people know when you see it. So yeah, it could be, but it's very likely it's Andrena, and because bees tend to nest in the same area because there's only a limited amount of their specific resource available to them, so they'll have to aggregate basically.
Yeah, thank you. We've just got a question from Charlotte asking about the slides available afterwards. Charlotte, we're recording this right now, so we'll send round the recording to everyone afterwards once that's on our YouTube channel. So if you have missed out, or if you do need to dash off early now, then we'll send those to you. You can catch up later. Oh, good one from Ruth here. Is it true that some solitary bees are paralysed/killed by drinking the nectar of rhododendron flowers? If so, seeing as rhododendron is a non-native invasive species, would you advise against having this in your garden?
I would advise against having them in the garden generally, because they're non-native and they escape into nature reserves and parks, and that can cause havoc. I know they've got toxic nectar. I didn't know that they killed them. It could be. I know that it can be psychotropic to some bees, but I didn't know whether it was poisonous. But yeah, I'm not sure on that one, to be honest. Yeah. I would advise against rhododendron though. They can be pretty, but
yeah, they go everywhere.
Yeah.
I have a question from J. Maddie asking, what is the distribution in the UK of the bee associated with lamb's ear? So the bullcardo, was it?
Oh, and Anthidium manicatum. It's mainly a southern species. It's really common southern species. However, it's moving more northwards because of the rising temperatures and climate change. And I'm yet to record it in the West Midlands yet, but we're likely to get it at some point. So it might be that it's moving its way up. It's very likely we'll start to see it in the Midlands more frequently. And if you plant more lamb's ear, you increase the chance of that happening. So get planting.
Nice. We'll have to get some of that in our gardens then. A question from Olivia. Was the black honeybee native to the UK, or are they reintroductions? I'm not sure.
The honeybee, sorry.
Yeah, it says black honeybee on the question. I'm not quite sure.
I don't know what a black honeybee is, but a honeybee is not native to the UK. It's native to Africa. It evolved out of Africa and spread all around the world.
Oh, thank you. A question from Mia, just asking what you're currently working on. What's your current research?
So at the minute, I'm looking at nature reserves throughout Birmingham Black Country for the Wildlife Trust and just documenting all the species that we've got nesting there. But my last one was looking at nesting preferences.
Brown, thank you. Okay, a question from Robert. With Hymenoptera, they often use chemical mimicry and also behavioural mimicry too. Oh, sorry, that was in regards to the Nomad question before. Sorry, I'm getting confused with all of this now. There's lots of questions going on. Another question from Thomas, just asking, how has the use of pesticides affected solitary bee populations?
Very, very badly. So the main one is neonicotinoids, and they're basically made from nicotine, which is an insecticide. And what it does is it doesn't harm the bee in the sense that it poisons it. It messes with the neurology of the bee. It's a neurotoxin. If we were to have it in the same dose, it would cause the same thing to happen to us. And what this does is it weakens the bee to diseases and to starvation brought about through a lack of flowers. So it's usually a combination of pesticides, lack of flowers, lack of habitat, which causes the decline. But yeah, bees, as the previous question said, they're very much a scent-based animal, and us pumping all this noxious gas into the atmosphere is not helping their ecology or conservation, unfortunately.
No. I've got a question from Ali, just asking how many species of bumblebees are there in the UK, and what are the best flowers to have in the garden for bumblebees?
28 species of bumblebee. Best flowers, I really like Bedalia. Bumblebees, because they're generalist pollinators, they will literally feed from anything. But my favourite is watching them in foxgloves. I think that you can really easily identify them in a foxglove, and a foxglove continues to produce nectar throughout the entire time. I find it quite fascinating to watch them in that. So I'd say foxgloves, but yeah, they're quite nice.
Yeah, I can back that up. I've got foxgloves in the garden too, and it's full of them. So yeah, definitely go for those. We've just got a comment from Mike saying that the Stephen Falk book is currently out of print, but the new edition is due at the end of the month. So keep an eye out for that.
It's really worth getting that book.
Yeah, definitely. Bear with me, I'm just reading through all the comments.
Okay.
Oh, okay, interesting one from Ed. He's currently in Kenya and has met some farmers who advocate making a biopesticide with boiled tobacco alongside other plants. Do you think this could be harmful to the bees if it contains sort of nicotine, or is it just a matter of the poison in the dose, you know?
I don't know. I think nicotine-based pesticides tend to be really powerful, and they can cause some serious problems. But yeah, I'm not sure about that one. I've never even heard of it. Boiled tobacco alongside other plants. Do you think this could be harmful to bees? Yes, yes, but I think testing needs to be done. Really, we should be moving away from pesticides and more towards natural predatory insects. So, for example, if you plant umbellifers in between agricultural crops, they attract parasitic wasps that will clear up all the pest species for you. And earwigs, for example, can eat millions and millions of aphids in a single season. So we need to be focusing more on biodiversity-based solutions rather than chemical-based ones.
Yeah, definitely. We've got a question from Clementine asking, have we got any species that nest in snail shells here? I think I've seen that one before.
Not here. I can't remember the name. It's an Osmia. I think it would be Osmia spinulosa. It's amazing. It will literally nest in a snail shell. Like, I don't know how else to explain it other than it makes its home inside of a snail shell. And yeah, they're really quite fascinating, cute little bees. think they're only found down south though, because they're like sandy habitats, unfortunately.
Okay, yeah, I've definitely seen photos of those before.
Yeah.
So we've got a question, well, a comment from Betsy. We were talking about those black honeybees before. Betsy is saying black bees are a Cornish strain from Sicily, she thinks, presumably. Not
No, I mean, I've heard of like melanic forms of bees, so you do sometimes get them, but they tend to be within species. I've not really myself ever come across them, but that's pretty cool that they exist.
Sarah's just commented as well. She's heard that red-tailed mason bees will nest in a snail shell.
Probably, yeah, that's quite likely.
Bro, I think we've got a minute, so if anyone's got any more questions, post them now. Oh, we've got a couple of people posting different links in there. I'll send around all those links again to everyone afterwards too. Ooh. There's lots of people saying thank you for a brilliant talk, Aaron.
Yes, very kind of you.
It was very, very interesting. And you managed to cover loads as well in such a short amount of time. It was amazing.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. Lots of people saying thank you. So I think, well, oh, sorry, there's someone else saying about the presentation. Yes, we'll send around the recording to everyone probably at the start of next week.
Yeah.
Ooh, Genevieve, you've got your hand up. Did you want to ask a question? Sorry, I've only just, oh, it's gone. If you did want to ask a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask that now. But if not, I think we'll say, well, thank you to everyone for coming along today, and a big thanks to Aaron as well for this session. It's been amazing, really, really useful. And yeah, bye, and hopefully we'll see you all soon on one of our next sessions.
Thank you. That was really great.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
you.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
So many people.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thanks.